citizens forum and go on to old business. And that is, the first item is on page 2 in your packet, approval to move forward with 139 Main Street. Would you like to do the introduction?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you very much. So we have Attorney Matt Decker here this evening. Matt has been working on this particular issue, 139 Main, which has also become 139 Main and 147 Main Street since at least December, perhaps even earlier, December of last year. And as a result of that, this project has taken on a lot of twists and turns relative to just what is entailed by the project itself. So initially we thought that 139 Main Street, as a result of loose masonry and other concerns, that the building was in imminent danger of collapse. We talked to the adjacent property owner. We had permission from him to go on into his property to look at the other side of the wall, since it shares a common wall with 147 Main Street. And to our alarm, we found that anything that happened to 139 Main Street would probably have a direct impact on 147 as well. That created a situation where people had to be removed from the property at 147, and we've launched into a long negotiation with the property owner at 147, and I think we've arrived at a final conclusion, and Matt Decker's here this evening to explain all of this and to seek your approval for a motion.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'll review as quickly as I can the background history of this. I think that John has reviewed some of it, and the council, I believe, has a partial timeline in their agenda packet of previous times that this matter has been before you. This actually dates back, I believe, to last summer. Towards the end of the summer was when the city received reports that some bricks had fallen off the facade of 139 Main Street and hit some vehicles parked behind it. The city brought in an engineer to look at the building, and the engineer's opinion was that the building was at risk of imminent collapse. The roof had fallen in, so snow and moisture and water and everything else was getting into the interior of the building, and there was a real concern that it was going to collapse. The council, on September 12th of last year, issued a 155B order authorizing the city manager to proceed with an order to do whatever is necessary to remediate the hazard, either to fix the building or have it taken down. I'm referring to RSA 155B, which is a state statute. Under that statute, the governing body of a municipality can issue an order to a private property owner to remedy a hazard. If the private property owner fails to do so, municipality can go to court and get an order from the court to step into the shoes of the property owner, remedy the hazard that the property owner hasn't taken care of, and then on the back end, ideally, the municipality recovers its cost by placing a lien on the real estate that it's repaired. So in this case, the owner of 139 is Twin State Property Maintenance and Development, LLC. That company is essentially defunct at this point, and there's no person behind it at this point that's managing or operating it. The company has been put into dissolution. And so the city was left in this case where you had a 155B order, but no person that was going to take action on it. So we went back to the district court, got an order from the court granting the city the authority to do the demolition of this building. That's when we had the engineer back in to look at the interior of the building, and that's when the engineer discovered the issue with the party wall. 139 Main Street is, from the outside, it actually looks more like one larger building with adjoining with 143-147 Main Street. That's a 7 or 8 unit apartment building, and the owner of that is New England Family Housing. So the fact that the party wall, the engineer, when he got into the interior of the building and specifically down into the basement, saw that the party wall had buckled substantially, and he saw that the ceiling and floor joists in 139 were built into this party wall. So any action to demolish 139 was going to cause this party wall to also fail, in the opinion of the engineer. and then you'd have apartment buildings on the east side of 147 Main Street with floor-to-ceiling windows, which is not ideal. So that put us into the next phase of trying to deal with New England family housing and trying to come to a solution of how we could get this demolition done in cooperation with New England family housing. We had to do it cooperatively because the 155B order that we had only pertained to the 139 main parcel, and we presume that the party wall is roughly half on 139 side and roughly half owned by New England family housing, so that's beyond the scope of our 155B order. As the city manager mentioned, the further the engineer looked at it, the more concerned he became that there was an imminent hazard of collapse, particularly in the winter. The engineer opined that the 139 Main Street couldn't sustain heavy snow loads, and that if we got a heavy snowstorm, it was likely to take down the building, and then the building was going to take down the party wall. So that was the impetus for the decision to order the apartment building on the 147 side vacated back in, I believe it was late January or early February. Since then, the city manager has been working diligently to negotiate a creative solution about how we can work with New England family housing to take down 139 and the party wall in a way that works both for the city and for 147 Main Street. So that's what we're here to report on today. Is we think we have that agreement now with New England family housing. I'll outline for you the highlights of that agreement. First, one of the first things that's going to be dealt with is that New England family housing is going to install an extensive shoring plan within the 147 structure to make sure that building won't be damaged when the demolition of 139 happens. The concerns of the engineer were twofold. One, that the party wall is going to fall away from the building. Might that cause it to collapse? Might that cause a collapse to propagate further into the 147 building? The other concern is that once that wall is gone, are the side walls going to buckle or be sustain other pressures from wind or other forces that might cause some other kind of concern? So New England family housing has hired an engineer and agreed to install some what looks like some good substantial shoring to ensure that his building is not going to be at risk during this demolition process. New England family housing is going to give the city a release, which is essentially the city's permission to have the demolition contractor take down the party wall that is partially owned by New England family housing. That's a very important part of this. Assuming we get the council's authorization tonight with the motion that I'll present shortly, our next step would be to put the project out to bid, where the city and New England family housing would jointly hire a contractor to demolish the building, demolish the party wall. After the party wall has been demolished, on the 139 side, we're hoping to have an empty foundation hole, and on the 147 side, New England family housing is going to have to build itself a new, what will now be its exterior eastern wall to replace the party wall. To complete the 155B remedy of the hazard on the 139 Main Street lot, the city needs to fill in the foundation so you don't have an open foundation hole, which is an attractive nuisance. And you can't fill that in until you've got a new foundation wall on the 147 side to hold back the dirt. Otherwise, if you try to backfill it, you're going to be pushing dirt into the 147 basement. So to deal with that issue, the city is going to contribute up to $6,000 to the cost of building that foundation level wall. And I'll note here that just as the cost of the demolition themselves would be recoverable under 155B, this would be we would consider this another part of the cost of the demolition and removal of the hazard under 155B that would become part of a lien on the real estate after the demolition is completed. Those are the highlights of the agreement. Because back in the fall, in September, when the City Council authorized the 155B action, the wording of that was actually included wording that the city manager was to attempt to preserve the party wall. Understand that's no longer possible, and this agreement with New England Family Housing now is technically beyond the scope of what it looks like the City Council authorized back in September. So we've prepared now a new motion for the council's consideration that essentially authorizes the city manager to, number one, enter into this agreement that I've been describing to the council, and then number two, pursuant to that agreement, proceed with the hiring of a contractor, assuming that the city gets an acceptable, reasonable bid. And then number three, to contribute that sum of not to exceed $6,000 to complete the backfill. So at this point, the project will, upon council approval, we expect it to be hopefully ready to go out to bid in the very near future. And we'll see what the bid process brings. So that's my summary, and I'll open it up for questions if anyone has any concerns about the presentation.
Assistant Mayor Dameron?
Yeah, just to kind of kick it off, and this is a question, I guess, for Mr. McLean as well. A two-part question. What's the present estimate of taking down that structure? And B, what happens if the bids that we get in are nowhere near that amount?
Well, I'll answer the second part. No, I'll answer both parts. And so the initial bid that we received before we had the party wall concern it was in the $60,000 range. I anticipate it will be higher than that. We do have funds adequate for this purpose, and the council will be in the driver's seat, so to speak, in terms of acceptance of any bids that we receive. So I'm anticipating that the bids could be in the range of $60,000 to $80,000. But we don't know until we actually bid the project. And what was the second part again?
Well, I'm wondering what the action might be or considered. Let's say the low bid comes in at $250,000. Now
Right.
Where do we go?
And I think I answered that as part of that. But the council is always in the driver's seat relative to the this particular cost. Mm-hmm. And so if it comes in higher than what the council or the city has available to it, then the council would be able to say no, thank you.
And we continue with it just the way it is sitting right now.
We'd have to find some other solution.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, other questions for Mr. Decker?
I was just trying to look up what the tax assessed value was, so we can put a lien on the property. We have recourse by being able to put a lien on the property so that we can get some of that money back, potentially.
Potentially, correct.
Potentially.
Under the statute, the costs of demolition go back to the court for approval, assuming the court approves the reasonable costs. Those costs become a lien on the real estate. Mm-hmm. If the value of the real estate is not enough to cover the lien, then the costs can be spread over other parcels of real estate owned by the same company, the Twin State company.
Does it matter if those get tax deeded, those other properties? Does that change it? Or can the lien still be added?
It is a question of timing where technically we won't be able to go back to the court, get approval for costs, and then have the lien in place until this project is all done and at the back end of it. And so if those properties are tax deeded in the meantime, then technically under 155B, they wouldn't be parcels that are owned by the Twin State entity at the time of when the lien is there.
Okay, so that's good to keep in mind then as we move forward with any tax deeding on other properties.
That's right. You'll want to weigh the the benefits of tax deeding a property now to capture its present value versus leaving it out there potentially available to have a lien placed upon it.
Okay.
And there is under RSA 80, the tax lien statute, there's a provision there for recovery of excess proceeds in the event there are excess proceeds. So if you resale a tax deeded property, the city recovers its principal plus interest plus penalties and other costs. The statute provides for an interpleader action where whatever monies you recover over and above what the city is owed, you essentially hand over to the court, and everyone who might have a claim for that money can then make a claim to the court for that.
Okay. Assistant Mayor Dameron?
Yeah, just to get it out on the record, both parties, I presume the city as well as the other party involved with this, each have their own independent registered professional engineers, and they've come to a joint agreement on the status of this building.
New England Family Housing has retained a licensed engineer, licensed structural engineer, to provide the shoring drawings, the shoring plans for what's required. Those have been submitted to the city for review by the building inspector, and those will be subject to a building permit. And the city also separately has its own engineer who has been familiar with the project since last summer. They both generally agree on the sequencing of how the demolition should occur in terms of proceeding from one side of the building to the other, cautioning that there should be no interior demolition attempted because of the risk of collapse. It needs to be all exterior, things like that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor O'Hearn?
Is this a unique process, or is this a common practice that what we're doing?
155B is a fairly common practice. The complication with the party wall, as far as I know, is a pretty uncommon practice. We don't have a lot of buildings in New Hampshire that are built right up against one another and share a wall like this. So this is a pretty unique circumstance as far as I know.
Councilor O'Hearn?
Is this going to open up any other potential doors down the road for some other properties that may come up similar?
In terms of setting a precedent,
Yes.
every circumstance is different. Hopefully not, because hopefully in most of these, in cases where there is a party wall, the owners on both sides of it will have, they've got a mutual concern to maintain that, and making sure that your neighbor on the other side of the wall is doing what needs to be done to make sure that that wall is being preserved in good condition. This circumstance with 139 is a little bit different. As I understand, 139 is sat vacant for many years now, even prior to the time when New England Family Housing was the neighbor on the other side of the wall.
Mr. McLean?
So there's also an opportunity for New England Family Housing to submit an application relative to 79E. Could you explain that process, Matt?
Yes, that's something else that is referenced in the agreement, in the release agreement, where the under 79E, a pre-improvement assessment is captured, and then the property owner's property tax liability is calculated based on the unimproved or unrenovated value of the building for a set number of years. So it incentivizes the property owner to rehabilitate the property, because for that set period of years, whether it's 5 or longer, they essentially don't incur the penalty, or they don't incur the tax liability for having improved their building. So in this case, that's something that's been discussed with New England Family Housing. There's a relatively low assessment on that building because it's got a failing party wall that needs to be replaced. And so there will be some potential substantial benefit to capturing that assessment value and carrying it forward a number of years. That the entire 7090 process will be subject to council approval. And we've been clear with New England Family Housing about that the city manager will support the application, but it is ultimately a council decision subject to New England Family Housing having complied with all the requirements under the statute.
Mr. McLean?
And finally, it is possible that New England Family Housing, because they are in this particular business, could actually bid the demolition of the project.
That's correct.
That's not part of any arrangement or agreement that we have, but just put on the record that it is possible that they could actually be a bidder.
That's correct. That's been a possibility that has been raised, that New England Family Housing might have the ability to do this demolition job. They might put in a bid for it. If they do put in a bid for it, they would be treated the same as any other bidder.
Thank you.
Councilor Kowalski?
Can somebody just walk me through the alternate scenario here? We don't proceed with this. It sits with barriers around it. Natural effects happen. It comes down eventually on its own. Is that?
Well, I think you just did a really good job,
Thank
Councilor,
you.
outlining exactly what the downside would be. I think the city has always recognized its responsibility in the absence of a bona fide owner that we could actually go to, and so the city has taken the initiative here to safeguard the public's interest and the traveling public as well, which is the right thing to do, the safety and welfare of the community, and this is the process that hopefully we can use to correct the situation, deal with the adjacent property owner, and ultimately bring this property back so it can be of full value to the community and used for a good purpose.
Councilor Kowalski?
I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I know it's been quite the road to travel. My overall concern is it does set a precedent in the community that let stuff fail long enough and will take ownership. And I know it's something that we have to do. But it's like mobile homes here. As soon as we didn't, there was a huge period of time we never took anything by tax deed. We started taking stuff by tax deed. And then people figured out that mobile homes, we weren't going to touch those. So now they are not concerned about paying some tax money on some of those. I'm concerned about setting a precedent. I think $60,000 to $80,000 is a lot of money. It's a lot of taxpayer money. And I'll leave it at that. This money has been set aside.
So this money, as I understand it, and hopefully Mary can help me with this money, as I understand it, is in a special reserve that's come from the sale of other properties. Is that correct, Mary?
You created an expendable trust for code enforcement to be able to deal with these exact situations, so you weren't putting it on the tax rate.
But I understood that when the city manager, McNutt, was here, that this property, even at estimates at that time, would drain that amount of money that's in there. Is that correct? Or
Well, we've been very careful not to talk about that since the former manager.
Yep.
Because it becomes a target for those to shoot at, so we've been careful to be very reserved about our discussion about the money, because it is in a fund for a very specific purpose, and this is one of those purposes, but I know the council and the community would like us to also preserve as much of that as possible for other actions that may occur. So we've been careful about that.
And final comment would be our timeline in getting to this point. Like anything that's of any value owned by this company gets spun off to something else. So we're actually just attaching or going after stuff that's worth nothing. And even if we're at that tax deeding point, we'll never see a dime of this back. ultimately, end of the day. I mean, I guess I've sat here long enough through the tax deed process, and even when we go that route and we get the properties back, there's a handful of them that are in identical condition when we took them to begin with. So I understand municipal responsibility here, but
So the comment I would have would be that hopefully this property can be repurposed, and properties like this can be repurposed. It does take a while for it to come back to us in a way that makes it beneficial to the community. But even from the appearance standpoint, I think that has a huge impact on the community as well when we remove some of these blighted properties, these derelict properties. And one of the things I call out in my report to the council is the fact that we're kind of in a reactive mode right now relative to these types of properties, and we may want to reconsider a policy that would get us out in front of some of this, because right now, and I think you've hit on this, Councilor Kowalski, that we have people coming in and basically taking these properties and doing nothing with them and creating even more problems for us, and then walking away and leaving us with the with all the cost associated with that. And I think the council would be, and the community would be well served to have a policy that might get out in front of that a little bit more than we have been of late.
Councilor Pope.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about what would have happened if we'd have never done anything to begin with. You did mention the quality of the improvement of the appearance of neighborhoods and such. I can remember when some of these actions, they weren't 155, were taken on North Street several years ago. I lived there, and the councils of the late 90s took down several buildings on North Street. That changed that entire neighborhood and raised property values overall. There were some of these four-story, several family, multiple units, tenements.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a nice way of putting them what they actually were. They were gone, and once they took those out, those values improved. Now we have places such as the Glassworks, Competitive Computers, a few other places. So it's hard to see it now when we're looking at $60,000 to $80,000 that we may have to spend, whatever. But I do see this as being a way of improving those neighborhoods and improving some property values and creating a little better of a appearance down there. So much as I hate that we have to take this bill, I also see the upside to that, having lived on North Street and seen the plus side of it.
Anything else from the council before I respond to Mr. Gauthier's hand?
I just had one more.
Okay.
That they brought. I just, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood from people that were seated here when all of the North Street rehab was happening that was a little different as far as it was done by in-house resources. So it was DPW staff actually doing demo work at the time. So there is just a slight difference.
It was a mixture.
Okay, so we're here for this piece of property, and I want to bring us back on track. Mr. Gauthier, do you have anything to say with regard to this effort?
Former Representative Francis Gauthier, Ward 1. My question is, if you give this building 147 79E, do you have a estimate of what that's going to cost the taxpayers over, 9 years? Well, what will that cost in reduction of taxes?
It's,
Pardon me?
Yeah, but do you have an estimate of what that would
I
be?
do have an estimate. I'm not sure I have it with me right now, Mr. Gauthier.
Because in February, I spoke with you in February, you said somewhere around $36,000.
I think that's
Over
right,
9 years.
but, I think that is exactly right. And I think that what they have is a 5-year, and then there's the potential for an additional 4. So a total of 9. And I believe that the 36 might have been the total for the 9 years. Yes, sir.
So you talk about $4,000.
Thank you for reminding me, and I've got the attorney is also confirming it, so.
That's very good. Okay, thank you.
okay, thank you. Anybody else that'd like to speak to this before we read the motion? Mr. Osgood?
Joe Osgood, Ward 1. The only thing that concerns me in this whole thing is, since the inception of this problem, Twin State Properties has transferred 2 properties off from their books, and they've sold them. In my site, I've seen cases where people have civil suits that they're bringing forward, and they put an attachment on the person's whole property until the outcome is done. I don't understand why that was not done. If there was an attachment put on their property, when we had even an estimate of $60,000, which we know that property's not going to be able to cover, they would have never been able to sell them properties without satisfying the city some finances. I'm a little concerned about that. And to say that they're not around anymore, they're selling property and somebody's getting the money. So that bothers me right there. They should have been tied up immediately. Thank you.
Mr. Decker, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, if I can just respond very briefly to that. We became aware of the properties being sold off, and I was asked to reach out and communicate with the council that was selling off those properties. We put a stop to that, and we learned, I believe, that the 2 properties that were sold off were subject to IRS liens. So at that point, if it was the federal tax man collecting on that point, those properties would already have been beyond the reach of what we could have attached.
We do thank Joe for his comments, because they're right on point, and we are aware of that and have been working on that very same thing.
Okay, so would the council, if there are no further questions for Mr. Decker, would somebody like to read the motion? Assistant Mayor Damon.
Motion to authorize city manager to act in furtherance of enforcement of RSA 155B order regarding 139 Main Street. Whereas the council by motion on September 12th, 2018, issued an order pursuant to RSA 155B3, ordering the owner of 139 Main Street, map 107, lot 015, to correct the hazardous condition of such building, or to razz and remove same, preserving the shared common wall with an adjacent building, bracket the order, and the Fifth Circuit Court, District Division, Claremont, issued an order on November 16th, 2019, authorizing the city to enforce the order.
Can we, that's got to be a typo.
That has to be. 2019, it's got to be a 2018, doesn't it?
That's a typo. It's correct, 2018.
So I'll go back to the third line. Hazardous condition of such building, or to raise and appropriate same, or remove same rather, preserving the shared common wall with an adjacent building, bracket the order, and the Fifth Circuit Court, District Division, Claremont, issued an order on November 16th, 2018, authorizing the city to enforce the order, and whereas the council by same motion on September 12th, 2018, authorized the city manager or his designees to undertake all actions and execute all documents as may be required pursuant to RSA 155B, to order the owner of 139 Main Street to correct the hazardous condition of such building, or to raise or remove same. And whereas an engineer retained by the city has determined that the common party wall connecting 139 Main Street to 143-147 Main Street, map 107, lot 1014, is also subject to imminent collapse, and therefore the correction of the hazardous condition at 139 Main Street cannot be accomplished without simultaneous removal of the common party wall, presumed to be located partially on the 143-147 Main Street lot and beyond the scope of the order. Now, therefore, the council authorizes the city manager or his designees to undertake all additional actions and execute all documents as may be required to accomplish the removal of the common party wall in addition to the building on 139 Main Street, including but not limited to, 1, the entry into a contract with the owner of 143-147 Main Street governing the terms of the removal of the party wall and securing a release of claims against the city arising out of the removal of the common party wall. 2, the hiring of a contractor to demolish the 139 Main Street building and the common party wall. And 3, the contribution of a sum not to exceed $6,000 to the owner of 143-147 Main Street for the partial reconstruction of a new foundation level wall for 143-147 Main Street in order to enable the foundation of 139 Main Street to be backfilled up to the property line.
Second. Okay, so the motion was read by Assistant Mayor Dameron, seconded by Councilor Kier. All those in favor say aye.
I think we should do a roll call.
Roll call.
Okay? Roll call, please.
Counselor Sark?
Yes.
Counselor Ahern?
No.
Counselor Stone?
No.
Assistant Mayor Dameron?
Yes.
Counselor Keniston?
Yes.
Counselor Kier?
Yes.
Counselor Kowalski?
No.
Counselor Pope?
Yes.
Mayor Lovett?
Yes. Okay. Thank you to all the parties who, and